and the land alienations needed to create national parks in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere never made it to the screen. That violence came from the realm of politics, and I accepted that the ecological crisis facing humanity was above these fleeting concerns. All I knew as a teenager was that beloved charismatic mammals were endangered, and that was enough for me to send small donations to the World Wildlife Fund, to study marine ecology and anthropology in Australia, and to work in environmental policy in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s. For various reasons, I became disillusioned with the quantitative quagmire of policy work and turned toward humanities perspectives. Projects about managing hazardous wastes or mitigating wetland destruction largely involved trying to determine an acceptable number of cancer deaths or putting a price tag on aesthetic experiences for cost-benefit analyses, a prelude to the ecosystem services approach that now dominates conservation in the neoliberal era. As I reveal in the chapters that follow, this approach had its origins in the early 1960s as former imperial conservationists tried to sell African leaders on the benefits of wildlife for their newly independent countries. As I began to fashion a second monograph, I imagined it initially as a kind of sequel to my first one on landscape preservation and national and regional identities in Germany. I had not dealt sufficiently with the issue of tourism in the first book, especially given Germans' well-known penchant for seeking out nature and wilderness abroad. A real glimpse of this came on a trip to Bryce Canyon National Park in June 2007, where the gift shop's checkout counter had another sign affixed to it, Kasse. Inspired by Samuel Hayes's insights about the relationship between white-collar consumerism and the post-material values that spurred modern environmentalism, I wanted to know how the dialectic between consumption and conservation in so-called soft or green tourism informed 20th century German environmentalism. And so, with Hasso Spoder's help, I began to look into the huge array of tourist guidebooks and tourist ephemera about German landscapes found at the Historical Archive of Tourism in Berlin, and put together a first draft of a monograph during a generous leave made possible by an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship in 2006 to 2007. While reading hiking guides to the Black Forest, I was drawn to the shelves of German-language guidebooks about foreign destinations and how these guidebooks framed places such as Africa, South America, and Asia for German-speaking visitors. A project for another time, I thought. I knew that Grzimek was a critical figure in post-war German environmentalism and tourism promotion, famous for encouraging tourists to save Africa's precious wildlife by booking package tours to the Serengeti, but I imagined that he would take up a chapter of the book, nothing more. In 2008 to 2009, I had done talks on Grzimek and his role in developing East African tourism at the American Society for Environmental History in Tallahassee, Florida, the Chasing Eden workshop at the University of Exeter, the Harvard German Studies Seminar, and as the Dante lecturer at Manhattan College. When I took up a fellowship at Princeton's Davis Center for Historical Studies in 2009, I decided to focus on the Grzimek chapters first, since his story fit the center's theme of cultures and institutions in motion. I soon realized that Grzimek's engagement in the Serengeti revealed a much deeper story about Germany's colonial past in East Africa and the German-German rivalry during the Cold War that made tourism history especially exciting and provocative. My fellow scholars and mentors at the Davis Center, including Dan Rogers, Julie Olcott, Mary Nolan, and Pamela Smith, came to the same conclusion that my mentor and friend at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., Christoph Marsch, had observed when I started the project. You really should make Grzimek and East Africa the center of the story. I loved the idea of engaging this material through a transnational lens, but I knew that writing a book of that scope would encompass unfamiliar histories and historiographies of African landscapes and decolonization that were not part of my toolkit in 2009. Luckily enough, new opportunities and new synergies emerged that made me more confident I could meet some of these challenges. In the summer of 2010, during a seminar